A very good morning and welcome. My name is Evanne Ní Chuilinn and I am delighted to be here this morning on behalf of VHI. This event is part of VHI's Health Insights, Workplace Health Insights programme, and it's based on research carried out by VHI and their partners, their research partners, Ipsos BNA. The research carried out today, we're going to discuss findings which have been research carried out involving 1,000 corporate employees. So the research findings are quite robust, and we have an expert panel with us this morning to discuss these insights and these findings. So first we have Dr Fiona Belton, who is clinical lead for women's health at VHI, started her career as a GP and then joined VHI to support the expansion of their women's health services, where she's now clinical lead for women's health. So you're very welcome, Dr Fiona Belton. We have Lorna Ross, VHI's healthcare and innovation lead, so worked domestically and internally throughout her career to date in leading healthcare innovation and design. So we're going to have a lot of discussions around what's happening and why it's happening and why it's not happening more so as well. And Amy Burke, of course, who is Group People and Sustainability Officer at VHI, so brings a wealth of expertise in terms of the HR industry insights and expertise. Now, it does seem like over the last number of years we've been having lots of conversations about women's health in the workplace, around menopause, perimenopause, and certainly these conversations are far more open than they used to be. Reports that 74% of women have reported that the conversation about women's health is a lot more open than it used to be, but this research is certainly showing that there is room for more. There is room for more openness, more discussion. This particular panel and this particular event will be interactive this morning, so we would encourage you where you can to get involved. We will have a couple of polls throughout the morning, and we will encourage a Q&A towards the end of the session as well. So we have about 45 minutes to discuss these findings this morning, and we'll dip in and out of the polls. So the first poll that I want to put to you is women's health on your agenda? So in your company, corporately, do you have an agenda around women's health for 2025? So as those results are coming in, I'm just going to give you some stats around that. The first thing that we're going to talk about when we get the result of those polls is stress. So stress is something that VHI have been tracking and I've been researching since 2018. And the research is pretty consistent. It shows that 20% of employees are telling us that they do feel stressed or even feel highly stressed. That's quite a significant number. If you think about 1/5 of your employees are feeling stressed. But we're seeing that it is higher amongst women, which is an issue in itself. So 28% of women who are experiencing perimenopause are reporting very, very high stress levels. And we do see similar trends when we're talking about things like menopause and menstruation issues, fertility and that. So it's an interesting take on stress. I'm just going to have a quick look at our poll. And yes, this is an encouraging start. 68% of our members this morning are saying that they do have an agenda around women's health in the workplace for 2025. So that's encouraging in itself, Dr. Fiona Belton. I want to ask you about stress though, because I mean, it's pretty obvious. If the stats are saying that 1/5 of employees are feeling stressed, yes, you're hearing it. I'm sure you're hearing it in your GP room or in your clinical room. But why do you think? What do you think is behind the stress, or have you any idea?
I mean, stress is such a it's got so many different causes and variable causes. And I suppose when we see somebody in clinic, we look at different aspects of their life. So we look at the biological causes, so whether they have any physical problems, illnesses, which might cause tiredness and really affect their reserve. And then the psychological component. So have they any ongoing stressors outside of work, within work, with family, with worries about children or parents? Financial concerns, and I suppose that would have a knock-on effect into their social circumstances. So even how things are at home with their partners, or concerns like that. So I think work is definitely a component of it, and for a lot of people, I think it is a really important part because they spend so much time there. So, but for me in clinic, I think. Predominantly we're seeing menopause and perimenopause, but we just see women with other, I suppose, physical issues as well. And they really struggle because their sleep is affected, and they will struggle, because they feel unwell. And when you feel unwell, you're tired. And when you're tired, your reserve isn't there. So that can cause significant stress.
So briefly, you are seeing that women are coming to you more stressed perhaps than men.
Yeah, I think women are, I suppose, dynamic creatures in that most women from their early teens until certainly into their mid to late 50s will have a constant fluctuation in their bodies. And they do, I mean, I think the research will show that they have more health issues throughout their lives purely by virtue of the fact that they're the way they are biologically built. So I think, yes, they would be more stressed. Yeah,
Lorna, it's interesting. Fiona would say that women are dynamic, and it's true. There's so many things going on, even outside of the workplace. You would say as well that sometimes it's an unpredictability. You don't know when it's going to raise its head. This beast called stress. But how, in terms of designing something to deal with it, how do you look at it?
Well, I think to Fiona's point, the stress is very often a response to an environment. So when you think about a design, you think about the environment that people are in and the things that are triggering the stress. And I think in the workplace, I know, women are relatively new into a workplace that was designed for men. I mean, I know my mom's generation didn't work. So I think in terms of thinking about women turning up in the workplace and bringing with them a really dynamic, a really potentially unpredictable kind of health profile into a space where the characteristics that are often rewarded is kind of real continuity of performance, the kind of indicators around success are around focus, kind of characteristics that are traditionally very male. And so, women work hard to kind of, to manifest those characteristics, but they are also managing this kind of internal, very dynamic kind of forces that really affect their capacity. So the cadence of energy, for example, in terms of their cognitive, capacity to focus. And I think also, much as there's a kind of conversation around equity where we want, I guess women and men are equal but different. And I think it's the difference in terms of, women's brains are different than men. I think they're starting to study the effects of stress in women's brains. Women typically have more of a fear response to being stressed than men. And so their instinct is to get away from it. So if you have this ambient level of stress that is persistent, and you remove yourself from the source of the stress, it becomes really toxic. And so I think women are really aware of that kind of low-grade toxicity to stress that they can't get away from. And then I think there's unpredictable aspects of things that are happening outside the workplace that just kind of contribute to this kind of cascading sense of stress. And I think I think women's response and capacity to deal with stress is very different than men. And I think the workplace has traditionally been designed to really optimize for performance that are kind of maybe not as native to women.
Amy, as a HR leader, how do we prioritise this, or how do we acknowledge that stress is an issue and make it a safe space to acknowledge that stress is an issue?
I mean, I think, Evanne, it's a bit like Lorna said, it's all environmental when it comes to the workplace. So we do know over the decades it has been built for, or designed by and built for a more male-dominated environment. So the first thing to do is acknowledge how can you create an environment and how can you design an environment that allows women to be brilliant? And starting by having that as a priority and acknowledging that as something you want to build as an organisation is the first thing, because you have to be very intentional in order to change the current history and legacy of the workplace. It needs to be really intentional. And I look at it in a couple of facets. The first is just, what does it feel like to be in the workplace? And we all know, everybody knows, when you feel good, you perform brilliantly. So how do you create an environment that allows you to be good? And then you look at it in a way which is, what's the structures? Whether it's policies and structures that allow it to use your language, to be safe. And the last area I look at is capability. What are the capabilities organisations needs to build? And that is male and female. That is not just looking at female capabilities, but looking at organisational capabilities. And therefore, if you look at those three areas in an environment where you want women to thrive and you want women to contribute and be at their absolute best, then the probability is you'll attract brilliant female talent. Females in the organisation will perform really well, and in our case, they'll perform really well for our members.
I just wonder, again, as a HR lead, can you acknowledge that stress would traditionally perhaps been seen as a weakness, or not being able to deal with what's on your plate as some sort of a weakness. And women are very loath to admit that, the balls are falling when they're juggling. It's very, very hard to do that. So from a HR point of view, can you acknowledge that it might be difficult to even accept that someone is feeling stressed and to actually go and seek help?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's unique to women, is the one thing I would say. I think demonstrating vulnerability in an organisation is historically seen as a weakness. I think modern organisations are pointing to being your authentic self. And if you are your authentic self, we're all flawed. We all have vulnerabilities. We all have moments of things being challenged. I think the difference is, it goes back to what Fiona said, I think the difference is that biologically females have more going on, and therefore it is more complex, and it is more challenging for a female to manage that than a male. So from my perspective, as a female leader in the organisation, I'm very open about my vulnerabilities. I'm very open about my challenges, and I do that because that's my personality. But it's also really important as a leader to give that space, to give that permission, to allow people where they want to, because it is choice, to be vulnerable back and to talk about their health back or their stresses back, because we all know what you see, you are more likely to do. Particularly junior females need to see that.
Absolutely. Fiona, as the clinical lead, I wonder at this point, can you define what stress is or how it manifests?
So stress is, I suppose, it's an external pressure. So it's an external pressure that has an impact on, I suppose, your window of tolerance. And your window of tolerance would be when you're sort of functioning at a nice, happy medium where things are kind of poodling along nicely. And I suppose different things can affect your window of tolerance. So even if you're hungry or if you're tired, but stress is probably one of the big ones that most people would report. And I suppose it's external pressures that anxiety, stress could tip into anxiety, but anxiety tends to be an internal pressure and a fear and a worry. And they can coexist, but stress tends to be external and more controllable.
Lorna, you're nodding along there, and you were nodding along to what Amy was saying as well. I feel like you're on the same page.
Very much, yeah. I mean, I think I find it's such an interesting. So, from if I kind of zoom out and think about, when we look at kind of transformation, like conversations inside healthcare that are not so much controversial, but there's tensions and there's contradictions. So I think the idea of talking about your health, anyone talking about their health in the workplace is challenging. It's really, there's a real vulnerability in having to kind of talk about your health or needing to talk about your health, and kind of looking for that kind of being exposed. And I think the workplace traditionally, again, as I mentioned, I think for anyone, the workplace can be a place where you don't want to be exposed or feel vulnerable or feel weak. But I think also women are being, they're kind of relatively new into the workplace, and there's a kind of maybe a vigilance around the degree to which we're trying to perform and we're trying to keep it together. And the idea that that women can get comfortable talking about such an intimate topic is really challenging. And I think, for me, the question is, do we make the workplace safer for women to talk about it, or do we figure out a way where compassion and understanding and tolerance doesn't have to be asked for? Like you don't have to explain why you need it. And I think the real kind of tension is some people are comfortable talking about it and asking for help and asking for compassion and asking for understanding, and some people are not. And so the dynamic is, do we wait for people to tell us what they need and find the language and give them the language, and permission, or do we find a way where we don't actually have to bring topics of health into the workplace?
You've brought us on to a very interesting topic, and I think possibly the most interesting topic that we're going to discuss this morning, which is around conversations in the workplace. And this is our second poll is going to come up now. And our second question that we want to ask you is, do you feel that your workplace has a culture where women feel supported to talk about their health? It's a very simple yes or no question. And we asked the same question of our female employees, those 1,000 people that we spoke to in the study. And only 43% of those women told us that their workplace has a culture where women feel supported and safe to talk about their health. So 61% of women told us that it's easier to pretend, 61% said it was easier to pretend that they had a headache than to explain that they have a women's health issue. So I think that is a key statistic. On top of that, a large majority of women who are experiencing menstruation issues or menopause symptoms told us that it does impact their work. That's a huge 80% of women who are having issues around women's health are saying that it is affecting them in the workplace, but only a small minority have spoken to their boss about it. That's about 17%. So that just points to a reluctance amongst women in discussing women's health in the workplace, even when it is impacting what they're doing, and it's impacting what they're doing on a daily basis. So we'll have a look at the poll. It's 50-50. Look at that. 50-50 so far. We might get a few more results in. But I suppose the big thing here, Amy, is to acknowledge that there is no one size fits all. Every woman is different, and we are just talking about women here. Every woman is different when it comes to speaking about and having conversations around women's health in the workplace. And Lorna touched on it, this business of privacy versus, vulnerability, but also seeking support. So I suppose, where do we start with this? Because it is a tricky one to navigate as a HR leader, I'm sure.
It is, and I think the most important thing is there is no silver bullet in this. And women are all different, and they're different at different stages. So, whether somebody is starting out in their career, or whether somebody is very senior in their career, or whether somebody is at a certain lifestyle, it is all really, really different. So you don't go in with a guide and say, here's how you manage it. It's almost individual. And there's a couple of things that we try to do to make it easier for women, but also to make it easier for men in an organisation to support, and to use Lorna's language, to be compassionate and to be empathetic across the organisation. So I do think creating an environment where it is okay to have a conversation is really important. And that means those that are receiving the conversation need to have the capability and the sophistication to be able to understand and to be educated. So there's a responsibility both at an individual level to educate yourself, and there's a responsibility at an organisational level to provide an infrastructure that allows people to be educated. I think there's also a responsibility to highlight it, so to talk about it, to have master classes, to do newsletters, to do podcasts, to do things like we're doing this morning. So you're allowing the conversation to flow, and you're allowing people to develop. And then the other side of it, of course, there are policies and practices that you need to build into an organisation. But to me, they're the second order, because writing a document on a policy is never going to change a culture. What's going to change a culture is conversation. What's going to change a culture is capability in an organisation. And if you do all of those things, it's layered and it's complex. And some, to Lorna's point, some females won't engage with it. And that is perfectly okay. What's not okay is if there's any way penalising that. You've just got to be really open with your colleagues. And what everybody's striving to do here is to make it a great place for people to be at their best, where all of us as individuals can thrive and contribute to the organisation you work at.
It's interesting you talk about penalising it, because Fiona, I'm sure you've heard women talk, to you about maybe having an issue and having. There's still a fear around admitting vulnerability to senior management, because again, it can and has traditionally been seen as a weakness, or you can't deal with your workload. So are you seeing reluctance to have the conversations, even from the patient's point of view, from the woman's point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny that, a lot of the times when people come into us, it's got to the stage where it's really having an impact on their health and how they're functioning. And so it often will end up that we would give them some time off work for illness. And there's a reluctance to do that, I think, because they're afraid of saying what it is. And I don't think they're aware that they don't have to say what is going on. I think it's really helpful that they do say what's going on, but there's a real reluctance to say that they're off because of stress. And in particular, they're reluctant to say they're off because of work-related stress, because they're afraid that someone will get upset with them or annoyed with them, or it will affect their career prospects. So we'd often have to have that conversation around, well, you don't have to tell anybody what's going on. They just need to know whether you're fit to work or not, but they also need to know whether you know, the workplace is impacting on your health. And I think that's where, you know, the independent assessment with occupational health is really important. But we would often, by the time people come into me, they'd be off sick could be off for weeks, and even are so anxious that they can't even phone work. They have to post the letter in, or sending the email becomes an issue. So I think having that awareness and even watching for the signs of it and training people to watch for the signs of it, so that you can sort of broach it gently. And how are you doing? Even something simple like that. A genuine how are you doing?
Yeah. Human, and that's all part of what we were talking about earlier, was just the culture. So, you know, if a senior manager is approachable, it's going to make a huge difference to somebody who is feeling that kind of stress. But how do you see it manifesting, or how do you see, I suppose, as an innovation lead, how do you see us tackling this? Because it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Whether or not people want to come and talk about it or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the, you know, some of the research reported back that I think was 74% of women said that they didn't want to be treated differently due to a health concern. And so when we read that, I mean, for me, it was like, I kept kind of focusing on this idea of different, and I was like thinking about what does that language is really interesting. It's like, you know, different than what? Like, you know, that there's some anomaly, there's something that's kind of, you know, atypical, there's something that is wrong. The idea that it's different. And if it's, you know, 74% don't want to be treated differently, so it is double bind. They want to have a safe place to talk about it, but they also then understand the consequences. That there's this idea that there's some kind of there'll be some impact, and I think that we have to examine the idea that people think there's a norm, and then there's different. And then we come back to, you know, what is normal behaviour in the workplace? And if normal behaviour in the workplace is to be really high performing and to not need any support and to not be weak and to not be vulnerable, and if that is the norm, everything that exposes you to feeling like you're not performing, you know, to the norm means that these women are going to say, I do want to be able to seek help, but I don't want to be treated differently. So there is that kind of, it's like a trade-off. I think women are always, we know this about a lot of the research we've done about the kind of cost benefit that women, I mean, they're like, this is like a superpower women have, cost benefit, you know, where am I distributing my energy, what am I doing, my attention. And I think it's the Pandora's box, do I want to go into something that I can't undo? So do I want to start talking about my health, and then I have to talk about it? And do I then want to have to, you know, it's like unpacking that is a big topic. And then do I get treated differently, and do I get marginalised, and does my manager think differently about my commitment to my work and stuff? So I think there's just so much, there's the conversation, there's all the invisible forces that are playing out in the workplace that we probably need to do a better job illuminating. Like, I think there's a lot of stuff still kind of taboo and stuff that's still going on in the workplace that we need to find language for.
Yeah, and it's not very tangible either to kind of understand where the line is, and whether there is sort of a permission culture within an organisation to actually have permission to be unwell and to explain why. I just want to remind people who've dialed in to send in your questions, because we will have a Q&A towards the end with our experts. The workplace offering supports poll is now at 100%, so that's good in terms of conversations. But I want to go back to that permission culture piece, Amy, because from a HR point of view, I'm interested to know, do you want to see a reason why somebody is on, for example, sick leave? Do you want to see an explanation? Do you understand that most people are honest, and most people are not going to, you know, go on sick leave when they're not sick? So from a HR point of view, I suppose, what's the level of cynicism when it comes to people being off? Because there is a reluctance there, obviously, for people to actually go on sick leave and to admit they're not well.
Yeah, I mean, you start off from the premise that nobody wants to be poorly. You know, that's the reality. Everybody wants to thrive and be healthy. So an organisation needs to start off at that level of trust with their colleagues. So, you know, if you start with that premise, then you're assuming positive intent, and you're assuming when somebody is sick, they are genuinely unwell. I think knowledge is important in order to be able to specifically support somebody. So, of course, if I know why somebody is sick on my team or in my organisation, you can help them more if that's slightly more specific. But that doesn't mean that somebody feels they have to share that. It's just about making sure that you can give them the right supports. The reality is, from a female perspective, you know, society has placed the burden of care on females. So whether that is for children, whether it is for aging parents, you know, that's just a societal issue. And organisations are never going to change that overnight, but they can support that societal pressure. And I know a lot of people talk about it at the inflection point of when you're more likely to be in a senior role. You are also more likely to have younger kids. You are more likely to have aging parents. So it's that sandwich of pressure. You know, you talked about it. Everything happens at once. So how do we allow that to be better? How do we encourage that burden of care to be shared? And simple things you can do, you know, promoting more male colleagues to take time off at term time. That's really simple to do. And if you promote that in an organisation, it becomes more normal, it becomes more acceptable. Whereas if you look at the stats, midterm breaks and holidays, females are ones taking the leave, not males. But if you really promote that in an organisation and encourage it and almost reward it, then all of a sudden you're helping female colleagues, not necessarily having to take that time off. So there are simple things you can do around engagement, education, and capability uplift across the organisation that allow you to, I keep saying, but allow women to be brilliant.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because, and Lorna, I guarantee you there are people on this call who have employees who are dealing with women's health issues, whether it's menopause, perimenopause, or fertility or infertility. And that's a very, very specific one, because it requires a huge amount of vulnerability to disclose that you might be going through fertility treatment, because obviously you don't know the outcome. It could be good, it could be bad, it could be, it's all up in the air, and it's very unsettling when you're going through it. So to then be vulnerable enough to tell your employer, it's such a private issue. Do you encourage people to disclose when they're going through something like that? Is it a little bit different than other women's health issues, just because of, I suppose, the level of it's just it's very private, isn't it? And it's quite unsettling. Speaking personally, having gone through it, it's very, very difficult to navigate what you tell your organisation.
So, you know, we've been doing a lot of work in the women's health space, trying to understand it ourselves. And I think, you know, you kind of look even at an adolescent place where women are kind of, and I think the culture is kind of cultural, women are kind of taught, you know, how much we hide and how much and also I think, you know, medically, like even a lot of what's women's conditions, particularly around their reproductive cycle, they're not diseases, they're not like illnesses, they're, you know, part of a cycle. And yet they can manifest as being, you know, really kind of debilitating for women, but they're not like formally diseases. So there's a lot of ambiguity culturally about where women's health starts and stops, and so there's a lot of self-care. You know, so a lot of women are like self-caring. So you teach your, you know, teenage daughter to self-care around aspects of, you know, painful periods and stuff, and so that just the kind of tolerance for going it alone is something that women are taught. So then they kind of turn up in the workplace, and it's that real kind of uncertainty about how much. Like people often think about what's normal. You know, women are still not aware of what's normal in terms of stuff I'm supposed to look after myself and hide, and when do I ask for help? And there's ambiguity around that generally. And so I think then when you get into kind of women will kind of start to progress maybe into a conversation around fertility or trying to, you know, family forming, and kind of just discover that it's something they're trying to get to understand their own cycle maybe and discover. And yet there's so much self-care. And when we were doing research, women would talk about DIY, like it's all about, you know, and menopause is classic, like, you know, they like try this and try that and trial and error medicine. So I think that there's just a lot of ambiguity about women's health and when you ask for help and in general. And then in the workplace, when do you need to bring that forward? And I think, you know, fertility and that is a very, very intimate conversation women navigate. A lot of people are thinking about deferring and delaying. So, you know, we have, you know, our population of female members would, you know, skew very much into, you know, professional women generally. And a lot of it is kind of this idea of offsetting, when do I have children relative to career? And that real trade-off between thinking about, and I know, kind of we think about the risk in delaying, for women pregnancy, but just also the instinct and the urge to delay so they can pursue career. So there's a lot, it's back to this idea of tensions. That's a conversation, and that conversation, I think it's a cultural conversation first, then it's a workplace conversation.
But it's also, and what's funny is, ironically, it can lead to stress as well. We're back to stress again, because if you're not coping very well with all of the stresses that come with women's health, and you don't feel like you want to disclose, you don't feel like you want to share, maybe that's your self-care, maybe your self-care is being private, but maybe you're taking on all of that extra thought process, the what ifs, and you're taking it and it's adding to the stress, and we're back to square one, Fiona.
I think there's an awful lot of layers to it, and I think it goes back to the culture of the organisation and a woman's personal feelings around it. And I think some people are very open, but I think there is a fear sometimes to say, I'm going through this, because then they may feel that they'll be judged. Well, herself will be off on maternity leave for a year, and then she'll be having another one, and they're afraid they'll be overlooked for promotion. And even though you can't legally do that, there is that fear there. And I think there's that layer to it, but there's also the actual going through the process of it, and it can be really turbulent. And when you're looking at things like IVF, there is the uncertainty, there is the physical interventions, the investigations that precede it, the psychological work that has to go into it. So a lot of people feel really unwell around the time of it, or very emotional or irritable. Some are fine, but often not. So I would have always offered, and when they would say, if we were referring on for fertility treatment, I would have said, if it comes to it, if you need time off work around it, you come in to me and we'll give you some time off work, even if it's only, a day or two later, for a couple of days. That, because sometimes you just need to do that, because women have to have children. If we don't, they're the taxpayers of the future. We don't have anyone to pay for our pensions if they don't have it. So we have to facilitate it.
Yeah, so it's back to the culture again, Amy. And I think you mentioned something earlier around being a leader in that space, and leading by example, and being open in terms of leading by example. So we're back to creating that culture, which obviously can't happen overnight. But on a broader scale, now I'm talking broader scale, is that the most important thing in terms of an open culture that is really obviously open to the employees?
I think so. I mean, I would say there's no one silver bullet on this. I think there are so many different things that we need to do, either as an organisation or society. If I was to say one thing, Evanne, it would be deliberate about it. So make a very specific choice as an organisation that you want to create an environment that allows all colleagues to be their best selves, including your female colleagues. So my one piece of advice to organisations, just have it at the top table. Have it as a conversation. Look, we're very lucky in the generation we're in right now that there is progress. I mean, when I looked at the report, I think it was 68 or 70% of females pointed to progress. Now, if you're me, or I suspect Fiona and Laura, it's not fast enough and it's not enough, but at least there is momentum. I think part of that is you've got more senior females, so people can see females operating at a senior level. I think more senior females are being open about taking time off, are being open about the conversation, whether it's perimenopause or menopause, are being open about care and their obligations to care. And therefore it goes back to you're showing that you can manage it, albeit in a really challenging environment, and giving permission for people to say, a very simple story, somebody got a very senior job when they were on maternity leave. And that trickled around the organisation because people were saying, wow, they were on maternity leave and they got the senior job. And then when they come back, they will be the senior person. They're very small individual steps, but when you tell those stories across organisations, they become cultural. I always talk about culture is invisible, but yet you feel it every day. And what makes feelings is stories. And stories are things that happen in any organisation. So for me, it's around promoting it, educating people. Having male advocates is huge. You can't do this with all females sitting talking about it. You do need to have male advocates. Funnily enough, it's usually fathers of daughters that are very good at this. But I do think there's a generation coming through now that are much more open, much more engaged, and much more understanding and tolerant. And again, I'm hoping that we won't need progress. It'll just be there at a point in time. But that does encourage me.
No, but we also shouldn't need men to have daughters to understand these issues. And it goes the same. I hear that all the time with sport. Oh, my daughter now plays sports. Now I'm interested in women getting equal support in the sports field. We don't need, fathers of daughters to drive this. It should just be driven anyway. But it is an interesting point that Amy makes about more female leaders. In roles now than there were, say, a generation ago, and you mentioned, women not being in the workplace a generation or two ago, because there is a statistic that says 63% of women say that they are reluctant to discuss women's health issues in front of a male work colleague. So again, we're back to a culture of supporting more women into these leadership roles and making sure that if they go for these jobs, that it's a meritocracy, regardless of whether they're in their fertile window. And so if we have more female leaders, it is going to be easier naturally in that culture to come forward and to disclose what's going on. Disclose is a bad word, but to feel supported, to have conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important. Like, if you can't see it, can't be it. And I think that's not just true for young people in terms of role modelling, but I think there's that kind of keeping women in the workplace and keeping them moving through, in terms of progressing. And so, from the research that we had done looking at kind of women's health and not just women's health, but a lot around kind of stress and kind of what we call care or burden, so commitments outside of the home. You see this, again, there's really subtle, what we call deceleration. So people's careers, we talk about on and off ramps, so there's these moments, where people are considering potentially going for a promotion, and then there's back to this trade-off where they start to imagine and envision and embody that new role and the commitment that would take, and then they kind of think about the impact, and then women often opt out themselves. And so there's these kind of behaviours where you see people decelerating their career at points where they have, maybe kind of ailing parents or children that are young children, and they're in this kind of pinch point. And so it's not the organisation not offering them progress. It's the proposition of that progress is just something that is too daunting relative to what's going on. And so what you're seeing is, even if a really progressive organisation is trying to move women, into leadership roles, understanding that trade-off that women are making in their heads in terms of that balance. And flexibility is a word that women use all the time. Balance. And they're great words, they're really positive words, but they also are dangerous words because they're trying to find that off-ramp, for the career. And in some ways that's the problem, is because why are they trying to find that? So I love the language. I think it matters that we say, we kind of think about balance and flexibility, but I think we should examine why women need more flexibility in their career. Like, what else is kind of drawing on their attention that they're the ones that need the flexibility. So
okay. I'm going to remind people who are watching just to send in your questions, because we'll have a short Q&A at the end. But the last poll that I want to put to you is, does your workplace offer specific women's health support? So this is not just conversations or feeling like you can have a conversation in the workplace. This is specific women's health supports, top-down management. So 30%, we asked our research participants the same question. 30% told us that their workplace offers specific women's health supports. 80%, though, of the female employees surveyed feel that workplace supports for women's health are very, very important. So 80% saying it's important, 30% saying that it's there. So we surveyed women on just some of the supports that you might expect to see, and the availability of them is actually quite limited. A few examples, and I'll get to the poll in just a moment. A few examples: 38% say that there are free sanitary products in the bathroom, 20% agreed time off for female health issues, and 15% say they have internal campaigns to promote female health in the workplace. So fairly low figures. I'm going to look quickly at our poll. It's 50-50 at the moment. So 52% say no, that there are not specific supports in the workplace. So I suppose it's a good time to bring Amy in and to say, what kind of supports should employers be looking at here, Amy?
I would always say start off with a diagnostic. Understand the position your organisation is in today when it comes to female health, female supports. Don't assume. So really understand your position today, and then as an organisation decide where you want to be, because there's so many different avenues you can go down. So where do you as an organisation want to be when it comes to that topic, and then be really deliberate, Evanne. Have an action plan, the same way as you would do anything else, and build out that plan and execute against it with really, really clear milestones. And the reason I say that is, my worry is it becomes a ticking of the box exercise in organisations if you say, oh, I must provide support. And then you write a policy that at best gathers dust or doesn't get executed, or you do things that are a little bit jazz hands in order to engage. So my view is do your diagnostic, come with an action plan, and then measure it sort of by female engagement, measure it by feedback, have conversations across the organisation. Is it having an impact? So you do get a different answer to that, which is, yes, as a female in this organisation, I feel supported, because you will get far better performance and engagement and commitment out of a cohort of colleagues when you do have those supports in place. But my big fear, and I've probably seen it, is that people perceive writing policies as the answer, and they don't become embedded and they don't shift the dial on culture.
I have a specific question that has come in, and it's an interesting one, because if a woman, this is the question, if a woman discloses that they are going to have a dip once a month, and that they need support during that dip, how are companies going to get around that? Because they may have a client that needs months-long, consistent attention. So ultimately, these companies want to help. If a woman admits they have a dip once a month and it could impact their responsibility or their work, how do you deal with that as a company?
I mean, and it is different in different roles. So, certain roles you don't have the ability to have that very specific flexibility, but in most roles you do. You can work around it. There's an individual that I know that just literally needs 2 days to be able to work at home. Now, not every role allows. If you look into our clinical environment, we do need our nurses and doctors in the clinics, so we don't have that flexibility, but you can roster it. You can manage it so that they don't have to be there at that particular time on a given month. So it goes back to, and I'm not in any way not answering the question, but there's no one answer, Evanne, to this. It depends on the role, it depends on the environment.
So you're back to flexibility again.
You are back, but you're also back to having that ability to have an open dialogue with your manager or the work environment, which says, I can perform at my best this way. Can we manage to allow me to do that? In most cases, the answer will be yes, where there's an appetite to do it. In certain cases, of course, it won't always be able to be facilitated, but in most it will.
I think one of the biggest themes coming out of this morning is the fact that there is no silver bullet, as Amy keeps saying, there is no one size fits all. What is your key takeaway from this discussion, from this research, from the findings and insights that we've discussed this morning, Aoife, as the clinical lead? What's your key takeaway or your message for employers?
For me, just from what I've been seeing, I think flexibility is really, really important, because women are dynamic and things change. And so if they, as you say, Amy, if they need some time off, once a month or once every 6 weeks, I think being able to do that is really important. If they need to start early one day or finish early one day a week and work later the next week, if that's feasible, I think they should be allowed to do that. There's something lovely about being able to collect your children from school once a week. Little things like that can really improve someone's quality of life. And also, I think if your workplace understands you as a person and sees you as a person as opposed to just a minion, I think there's going to be that loyalty. And you're more likely to stay. So for me, I think flexibility.
Flexibility, but not on names. I think I called you Aoife by accident there. I'm so sorry, Fiona.
Okay. I like the name Aoife.
And Lorna, I suppose, flexibility is a big one, and Amy has given us an idea into what's tangible and what can be done in terms of having this flexibility, but also supports are visible, and it's top-down management as well in terms of leadership. But from your point of view, what is your key takeaway around how organisations can show that they're flexible so that people can see that it is something that it is worth pursuing to have these conversations?
So what I would love to see, and I think the research has been, I think there's an opportunity to think about this as being a kind of a future of work conversation, that almost like the kind of case study around women's health in the workplace is actually potentially a bigger conversation about, kind of the humanity of the workplace. And there's a lot, we think about neurodiversity, we think about mental health in the workplace. There's a lot of things that are kind of topics that are kind of turning up in the workplace. And maybe women's health is just helping us kind of unpack, is the workplace, does it have the kind of nuance and compassion that it needs to have for the next generation? Like we know that younger people are coming through. There's a different level of resilience. The world is very, there's a lot of challenges. We are trying to prepare for a younger generation coming into the workplace. We're going to have to address aspects of mental health, diversity, and so women's health is kind of helping us lead into that conversation. I think we should be looking at this as a conversation about the workplace itself in terms of performance, behaviours that we admire, how we reward, the cadence of how people work. I mean, we're in an era of AI and machine learning. We should be thinking about the kind of the human and purpose and product. What is productivity? It's not a factory model anymore. So I'd love the women's health conversation to actually kind of be seen as an opportunity to really examine the culture of work. Because if a culture was designed that worked for women, it would work for everyone.
That's a really
good,
that's a really good
for
synopsis.
Everyone who comes in, it would work for them.
I think that's a really positive synopsis and a great way to finish our conversation. We do have time for some questions. We're going to do that in a separate post-event video. So we will get to your questions that you've sent in, and I do appreciate the questions that have sent in and the poll results as well. It was a 54% no on the specifics in terms of supports in the workplace. So what Amy said is certainly worth rewinding and having a listen to. But I want to thank my three wonderful guests this morning and you for joining us. We will have a feedback link in the chat, and there's also a QR code on the page as well. It'll take 1 minute. It's literally just click into the link and give us a bit of feedback on this morning's session. And just a reminder as well that there will be, to mark World Menopause Day in October, Dr Fiona is going to do a talk on that. So it might be of use to your employees as well, just in terms of navigating menopause and perimenopause. So that will take place next month, and there'll be more details in your community wellness events email. Obviously, as always, lots more information on VHI website as well on the Workplace Health Insights section. So for now, my thanks to Amy and to Lorna and to Fiona. We've had a lovely 45-minute chat this morning, and we'll be back again in the next section to answer your questions. But for now, slán go fóill. You are very welcome back. We're going to take some of the questions now that came in during that discussion from VHI's Workplace Health Insights research. And Amy, I think you're going to be very busy because we have a lot of questions that have come in from a HR point of view, which is as to be expected from the call that we had this morning. So this is quite specific. So a question: how do you manage a situation when at company level there are policies and procedures to support people's health and well-being, but that at localised level they're not being implemented, they're not being followed?
I mean, I'd start by saying that shouldn't happen. So if an organisation is intentional about having policies and procedures, the obligation is for all colleagues to follow those. So if your manager or if your leader in an area is not applying those policies, then I would raise it. I would raise it with HR, or different organisations have different ways of raising issues. So whatever the appropriate way of raising that issue is, because that means that an organisation has an intent, but the impact is not there for people. So I would be very specific about raising that. It goes back to earlier speak up, or goes back to a fear around raising it. We have got to own our own career journeys and own our own health. And if an organisation doesn't take you seriously, then I suspect that organisation isn't for you. That would be how I would address it. I would hate to see it happen in any organisation, Evanne.
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose at local level, personality clashes shouldn't come into it. It's policy or bust.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what we spoke about earlier, though, which is, a policy is a manifestation of a culture. So, if that is happening, I suggest that it is a tick box exercise, that you've just written a policy because you feel you should, as opposed to you are really intentional and really serious about supporting females in an organisation to be brilliant and contributing to your organisation. So that would stem to a cultural issue as opposed to necessarily a personality issue.
Okay. Lorna, I'll come to you next, because we are talking about culture there as well. And you mentioned earlier in the conversation about how the workplace was originally designed for men. So how can we level the playing field now for women? Huge question.
Yeah.
No pressure.
Yeah. I think it's a little bit, I think even from an innovation perspective, I think when you think about change, the most important thing is to kind of like describe, where you want to be or what you want to get, and then work back. And so I think for organizations to really describe where they want women to turn up, like what kind of character, what aspects of women's, kind of capabilities and potential they want to see evident in their culture. So they might say, well, women are very collaborative, and there's a lot of kind of really, really good at kind of reaching across different disciplines, and consensus building. So you might say we're going to build a culture that actually plays to all the strengths of women. And so you start to kind of tease out and value and reward characteristics that actually are really inherently what women are really good at. I think so. I would say describe the way the kind of attributes that you want to have women kind of contribute, and then work back and saying, what's the barrier? Like, what's currently the barrier? So rather than kind of trying to fix women, I think it's to think about if this workplace were really about women really excelling, and that if someone came in and looked at it and said, all of the strengths in this organization are because women really are authentic. They can really bring that, what's different about them. What would be different about it? And I think things like, really strong collaboration. I think, really, kind of communication is very different for women. Women are they think laterally. They're very, very creative. They may be less kind of focused. They look at multiple solutions to everything. So from a creativity perspective, women are very creative because they don't typically look at one solution, they look at multiple solutions. So I think there's like, how do you really amplify things that are really, really strengths that women have? And then where do you want to put them in your organization? And I think work back from those goals. If you set yourself goals, you work back and say, well, what's stopping women contributing that?
It sounds like there is a huge amount of work to be done as well in certain instances around actually getting to know your employees. Like, who are they? How do they perform? How do they respond? What motivates them? All of that stuff. Not just around women, but men as well. Around, not every single woman is going to be the creative piece, or, you're going to have alpha women, you're going to have women who are going to fit in different ways. But I think actually knowing your employees and what motivates them and how they perform as well is crucial.
Yeah. I think definitely. And I do think that, workplaces that, maybe are run by women. I mean, I know we have, I've worked in a lot of really kind of, amazing, I think in healthcare, you'll see this. I mean, in healthcare is the amount of women that work, because it is an industry, it was originally a vocation. I guess an awful lot of women came into it as a vocation. It's a lot around compassion. There's probably a martyr element to professions that women are more kind of accepted into, which is unfortunate as well. But there's so many women who work in healthcare. So you think about the idea that they bring with them really unique, kind of a warmth and an understanding and a humanity, and they kind of turn up in industries, and they're the backbone of so many industries. And then yet you look at maybe the C-suite still, and you're starting to see, are they actually making it through? So they're the real, I think a lot of women are really the backbone, like teaching is the same. I mean, these industries that are really about vocations and about giving to other people. But women can get really stuck in those industries, and they're not turning up maybe in the kind of really senior roles. So I think it is to kind of is to say they're contributing, but are they actually really succeeding? And they can be contributing into an industry or into an organisation, but are they really succeeding in that organisation? And I think I would say look at the barriers. I mean, you look at the really evident and also all the invisible aspects of what is stopping women progressing from a career perspective.
Laura mentioned the word compassion there. Fiona, I have a question here around compassion really. So how should HR address fertility or miscarriage related issues in a compassionate and inclusive manner? It's a big question as well, but it's hugely important because it's one of those ones that, as we mentioned earlier, it's difficult to bring up. So if somebody does bring it up, they're already vulnerable. So how do you help them through it?
I think compassion and, you know, obviously on a personal level, it's compassion with managers, I suppose, recognising that they may need time off, they may need a lot of time off, or they may need very little time off. They may want to just go back to normal, or they may need to go through a really intense grieving process on their own at home. So I think that's from a miscarriage point of view, and fertility can be a really exciting time. It can be a really nervous, anxiety-inducing time, and it can be a very sad time as well. So I think it's recognising that these are human beings that are going through this, and no two people are going to respond the same way. So the individual approach and listen to what they need.
I just wonder who drives it though, you know, so from a HR point of view, if somebody comes to their line manager with an issue where they're feeling whether it's that they need time off or whether they need to work from home, or it could be anything, but who drives the compassion? So is it a HR contact? Is it a line manager? If maybe it's a male line manager, do you encourage a female leader within that department to check in? Or from a HR point of view, how do you manage that situation?
I think fertility and miscarriage is not just a female issue. You know, there's usually somebody else there involved as well. And they may respond differently because, again, they're different experiences of it. But I think training, being aware of it, giving them the language to speak about it is very important. I think, and Amy, you're the expert on this, but I think having the policies so that they're not very anxious or nervous responding to somebody when they do approach them about it. I think when you're very vulnerable and you go to somebody and they don't know where to look and they're all terribly awkward and don't really want to get into the conversation, that's very, it's a real knockback, and you feel there is nowhere to go. You don't feel safe, I don't think, in that situation. So I think giving men and women the skills and the language and the confidence to deal with that when it does come their way, and it probably will.
Yeah, it probably will, absolutely. Amy, I'll ask you the same question because, as Fiona said, it isn't just a female issue. Obviously, the female might be physically more affected and emotionally more affected, but it does affect men as well. And, you know, whatever about women coming forward, it's very rare, I presume, that you would have, from a HR point of view, have a man come forward and say, you know, my partner has, you know, been suffering or whatever. It's very, very, I think there's still a lot of taboo around that subject.
Yeah, I mean,
but from a HR point of view, how do you approach the compassion?
It is rare, but it is becoming more of a conversation point, which again, to me, just demonstrates
encouraging
the progress piece. You have surrogacy as well now, so you have, you know, male partners who are going through surrogacy, and how can you support that element of it? So it's not one gender. From a HR perspective, it's all about giving both the individual and the manager the tools. And that starts with clarity around policy, clarity around what it is the organisation supports. Because to your point, Fiona, is if that's clear, well, then at least you're having a conversation that's not ambiguous, and it's not worrying, and it's not creating a can I, can't I. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is just capability. You know, if you manage a team of people, you have an obligation to be capable to have the conversations. And that is the most important element, which, you know, it doesn't matter whether it's male or female. Of course, you know, if somebody said, I would prefer to have a conversation with somebody else, that's 100% okay. And I would suggest most organisations will make that happen. It's rare that it's into HR, and that's because, you know, you've got 2, 3, 4,000 colleagues in a small HR department. That's why managers are so important. But of course, in certain situations, Evanne, it will come into HR. But this is why it's so important, the relationship between your manager and your team, because that's where you're going to get your day-to-day support. That's where you're going to get your day-to-day, even team colleagues. If you have a health issue, or if you have a challenge in life and you spend 5 days a week at work, the team around you are going to be those that are going to help you the most. So being able to have those conversations, if you so choose, is fantastic, and being able to get that support is super.
I have another question for you, Amy. It came in as well. So how do women's mental health needs differ across life stages, and how can HR policies address these evolving needs? It's another huge whopper of a question, but it's a good point in terms of life stages, because with companies like VHI, people do tend to stay for quite a time. So they spend a lot of their working life working with this company. So mental health needs will differ across life stages, and you've already mentioned this sandwich pressure as well for some women at a certain age as well.
I mean, it goes back to what we talked about earlier. I hate boxing it because I think, you could have another hour-long debate on mental health, nothing to do with women's health, because it is so vast. And there's stigma associated with all of it still, no matter what way you look at it. But if you can understand the pressures and challenges to do with a female life and the complexity associated with young females, adolescent females, starting your career as a female, and depending on where you go into an organisation, do you go into an organisation that is predominantly female? Do you go into an organisation that is predominantly male? And what does that do to you as an individual? And how does that impact your health, whether it's physical or mental, through fertility, and then right into perimenopause and menopause. So, that the life cycle of female health is, I think you used the word dynamic earlier, Fiona. It is quite challenging, and I think you could probably correlate that with different emphasis on different types of mental health, whether it's anxiety or, a lot of the conversation at the moment is around the brain fog associated with perimenopause and menopause, and how debilitating that can be, and particularly if you're in a workplace where you are required to be on your game, and you are required to, if I'm sitting here with you and all of a sudden I'm going, oh my God, I've lost my train of thought, and somebody's not going to go, well, she's perimenopausal, just go, she's incompetent, she doesn't know what she's doing, and you've got to be able to create an environment where it is okay to say, hang on a second, guys. And I will do that with my male colleagues. I will just say I'm having a moment. But I'm fortunate enough that I have an open enough, relationship to be able to do that. But you probably shouldn't have to be able to do that. But it is different for everybody, and that's why I'm very cautious, Evanne, to box it into this is what A happens and this is B, because I do think there's no simple answer on this. But at a personal level, in my own experience, being supported by the colleagues that are around me, no matter what it is what gives me strength, whether that's my own team, whether it's the people I work with more regularly. I think that is what makes it easier to be well in work.
I think it's just listening to Amy there, Lorna, I think it's actually, it can't be underestimated, the significance or the impact of a senior leader acknowledging I'm having a moment, or acknowledging having to take a minute, or because unless you actually see that it's normal and that it is something that can come as a challenge for everybody, and you see a senior leader taking a moment of just vulnerability, and I'm going to pause for a sec or whatever, but that's not tangible. So in terms of policy, you can't just put that in a policy, but it's something that, and again, we're back to culture, because it's top down. So if you have senior leaders behaving in a way that, that shows that it is okay to be vulnerable and to have those moments. Am I making sense? Can you see, because you were nodding along when Amy was explaining about how to try and navigate these challenges.
Yeah, it's so difficult, because it's it's like back to the playing field. I think that, you know, senior female, I think about myself, like I've worked 35 years. And so, I work in the design community. I'm probably the granny of design. So I think I have like managed to hang on to my career. And I would say within my community, I've been able to kind of like try and role model the choices I've made and the kind of, you know, pursuit of things that, while also balancing family and stuff. And so I think that can happen, to a degree it can happen, but I think what you also can't do is that women being vulnerable, there needs to be equal vulnerability, I guess. So we need to find a place where men are equally vulnerable. So I think, you know, for seeing a senior leader, female leader, be vulnerable, we need to equally see that a male leader is vulnerable. So it's back to this idea that, you know, women become exposed, or that we have to be kind of brave and courageous and bring stuff to the workplace. But if there isn't an equal and opposite kind of vulnerability that men are experiencing, I think it's really, really hard for women. Mm-hmm. And I think it becomes, this is, I know, a really loaded word in terms of tokenism, but I think, you know, it's very hard to hope that women who get to a senior leadership position, that they're the ones who have to, at an individual level, show their vulnerability still. Because in a way, it's just messaging to other women that we still have to be really vulnerable in the workplace. And I really firmly believe that it's much more about making the workplace a place where, you know, a woman's health doesn't determine her success. I mean, it really shouldn't be that your success is determined by how much you are in control of your health. I mean, in the same way as it shouldn't be for anybody. So I think witnessing that is important, but it also can send a mixed message. I think there's a mixed message in that for women.
Okay, Fiona, before we go, there was one more question, and it was really just, and this is briefly what you're seeing, what people are coming to you in the clinic with. What are women struggling with?
So at the moment, the main, I suppose, issue that we would see would be menopause and perimenopause. There's so much more awareness of it. And as Amy said, probably the most significant symptom that they find difficult at work would be brain fog, concentration, things that they just can't, not that they can't do it, but it's just so much harder. And it can sometimes be difficult to treat, but even I think, you know, talking people through that and explaining that there is a very real physical, biochemical, hormonal reason it's happening. There's neurological changes that are happening throughout that transition, almost as if you're like a teenager or someone going through puberty has neurological changes to hormone levels. And so women are also going through this. So I think it's amazing that they do what they do, going through all of this. I think there's been some studies to show that they still perform to the same level, but they find it so much harder. And I think recognising that. And it's interesting, just to come back to your point about leadership and people in higher positions, you know, modelling it. There was one person who said to me she was at a conference and a very senior woman was presenting and she saw her just stop. And she paused and she could say, oh, and then she just got her train of thought back and she kept talking. And she found that really reassuring to see that this really senior woman who was obviously in her 50s, and she said, I think that's probably, she didn't know for certain, but it made her think maybe actually she just lost her train of thought for a minute. But she didn't get flustered with it. And I think knowing that it probably will happen. I mean, if you're blessed to live long enough, you'll go through it as a woman. So I think it's acknowledging it, recognising it, and I think you need to mind yourself a little bit more around that time as well, because your reserve isn't quite what it is, but it should come back as well.
Yeah,
you know, it's not forever.
I'm so glad I asked you that question to finish up, because, you know, it's so important to highlight the challenges but also the solutions. So I want to thank you, Amy, Lorna and Fiona, for doing that extra session of questions following our VHI event this morning. So I want to thank you for your attention, and as always, keep an eye on the Health Insights part of the website for more information on upcoming events. Slán go fóill.